Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Conversation Design Podcast by Botsociety, where we interview designers and developers and ask them questions about conversation design, creativity, and more. My name is Monica. I'm a product manager at Botsociety, and I will be your host today. As you might have noticed, we've been away for a little while. We're coming back with a special episode with Botsociety's own co-founder and CEO, Vittorio Banfi, partly to explain why. On this episode, I interview Vittorio about building Botsociety 2, the complete conversation design tool, learning from Botsociety users, and where conversation design is going. Plus, instead of the regular audience questions, we'll feature some questions from Vittorio's talk at San Francisco Design Week. Hope you've all been well, and I hope you enjoy our return with this episode and those to come. Hi, Vittorio. Thank you for being with us on this episode of the Conversation Design Podcast by Botsociety.
I'm excited to be here.
So while some listeners who are familiar with Botsociety and Voice UX know you already, you've been behind the scenes in the podcast so far. Can you please introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. I'm Vittorio. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Botsociety. As you may have guessed from my name, I'm Italian originally. I moved here in California around 3 years ago.
Awesome. So maybe not everyone knows the founding story of Botsociety. How did you and Stefano, our co-founder, decide to start Botsociety in the first place?
Yeah, that's kind of a funny story. So we were building bots for big companies in Italy, me and Stefano. That's how we started, with zero funding, and we didn't even start with the idea of doing a startup, right? It was an agency doing creating bots and conversational agents. The reason why we started Botsociety is because we needed it. So we were building bots for big companies in Italy, me and Stefano. And it was a crazy ride. You know, we started with zero funding. We closed two big deals, one with Fiat Chrysler and another, the automotive company, and the other one with Piaggio, which are the guys who are making the Vespa scooter. And so we had to hire two people in the first month of operations, and we had a lot of work. So it was crazy. But in this, we were sure that someone in the Silicon Valley was building a conversation design tool, because we saw that chatbots and voice interfaces, you know, they're just another interface. And so you need someone to design it first to answer a bunch of, you know, conversation design questions before you actually write the first line of code or you launch the bot. And so nobody was doing that. And we really needed it. And we were in a hurry. So during one weekend, we came up with, we scrubbed together what was then the first version of Botsociety for ourselves. And then on Wednesday, Stefano was like, okay, maybe we should buy a domain and put it out. So we put it out and people started to sign up. And then Dennis Young from, that at the time he was a Dashbot, he put us on Product Hunt. And so it grew like crazy from there for the first weeks. And so we realized that was more interesting than, you know, building bots. So we managed to find a way to sell that small, you know, newly born agency. And with that, we moved to California.
Great. What was your vision for Botsociety when you started it? If there was a vision, since it does sound like you were just building something for a need that you had.
Yeah, I mean, there was a vision. We just assumed that somebody else was going to do it. Because, so the vision is the conversational interfaces are just another interface. And so you need designers involved to solve a lot of design questions, but they're a fundamentally different type of design questions. For example, you don't have, in a conversation, you don't have buttons, but you have questions. And you don't have a color, but you have a personality. And you don't have screens, but you have flows. So you can take some principles out of the graphical user interface world and bring them to the conversational one, but not all of them. And some of them you need to reinvent. And so, and for sure, you cannot use the same design tool. If you try to design a bot with Photoshop or Figma or Sketch, it just doesn't work because you need different stuff, because the conversation is different. And so we think that a lot of companies are going to leverage this type of conversational interfaces. And now it's more clear, but like this was back 2017, it was not that clear. And so we saw that like a new generation of designers would, pick up the challenge and work on those type of interfaces. And so we wanted to build a tool for them. We want to build a tool for them, and we did. So this was the vision. But at first, like we thought that somebody else was going to do it. So we didn't think of it as a vision. We just realized it later that was the case.
Yeah. And now that you described kind of the questions you considered when you were initially building Botsociety, I just want to mention for the audience that neither you nor Stefano have a background in conversation design. So how did you decide to go into it, and how did you find yourself kind of in the place to need this tool in the first place?
Right. I mean, we built our conversation design skills over time, and so when the messenger bots came out, we started the agency, right? But I think in general, like if you're passionate about design and UX design, then doing the switch to conversation design is not a huge step. I think it's a bigger step, kind of paradoxically, if you arrive from an engineering background, because like you will tend to look at stuff in the right way, but in the kind of like engineering technological way, instead of like putting yourself in the user's shoes. And since the technology is moving so fast, I believe it's kind of like a separate focus to do that, especially in this type of interfaces. In more mature technologies like websites, you can have kind of like a hybrid role, because the technologies are not moving that fast anymore. It's kind of like a set standard for websites. Both on the technology and design side, like the best practices are more or less set. In the conversational world is the opposite. So you will basically everyone in the space is arriving from a UX background or another type of designer background, and then switching that to conversation design. And I think we started to build bots for fun. A lot of for years before it turned into a job. So and I feel like a lot of folks in the space have been doing that, right? Like on different chatbots on IRC or Skype or Messenger and stuff like that.
Yeah. And exactly because there's no official best practices yet, there's so much space to do that and to innovate and to be able to switch from another industry into this. I'm curious, when you started Botsociety, or when you were building these, when you were building chatbots for the agency, where was the conversation design industry?
In 2017, there was no basically industry as we think about it now. Like there was no company hiring specifically for conversation designers. There was no, conversation design course or certification like there is now. And so, it was very, very early. And so I think we were fortunate enough, hopefully, to contribute a little bit to that, but it was basically the whole, technology industry that kind of like figured out that was an important, skill and function to have the moment that you sit down and say, okay, how to automate this process? How do we create a conversational AI experience? So I think we've been fortunate, but it's been crazy, especially in the last, 2 years, basically since we started, how fast it changed. And I totally agree with you that there's no best practices set yet, but there's a lot more than 2 years ago already. Like there's a lot more content, there's a lot more courses, there's a lot more people, there's a lot more companies hiring for that position.
Yeah. And even some of our previous guests have been, some of the first employees or like the leads of new conversation design teams at very big tech companies. So it's been great to see that in my time in the industry. Now, if we can move on to the next section of the episode, I want to kind of reveal the reason that you're the guest on the podcast today. So we've recently launched Botsociety 2, and can you please tell us more about that?
Yes. So Botsociety 2 is the complete conversational design tool. You can design anything, like you can design any type of chat interface, any type of voice interface, any type of device that you think about, you can do it. And then you can design the whole process. So from the prototype, which is what Botsociety 1 mainly was doing, to the complete blueprint, every flow, every message, every connection.
Great. What inspired Botsociety 2 and this change?
Yeah, it was kind of pretty scary, actually. So basically, 1 year ago, we realized that what was happening is that our users started to use Botsociety in a way that we didn't expect. And so basically what was happening is we built, if you remember the story before, like we built the first version just during a weekend just to have something, right? And the first need was, okay, we need a prototype tool to bring you from zero to showing something to your customer, to your colleagues, very, very fast. Kind of the Envision for conversational interfaces. If you tried Envision, which is great. But what we realized is that our users were asking for more. They needed more. They started to add like hundreds of messages to the same prototype. They started to, define not only the main interaction like the happy path, but also the different other ones like the less happy paths, the repairs. They started to add multiple use cases in the same prototype. And so we realized, oh my God, we need to build a complete design solution that brings you from zero to kind of like the complete blueprint. In other words, like we started to to build Envision, but we actually need to build Photoshop for bots, or Sketch for bots, or Figma for bots. I hope I'm bringing up tools that the listener knows. And so we said, okay, how do we do this? And we realized that we needed to bite the bullet and rebuild it almost from scratch. Of course, taking everything that we learned from Botsociety 1, but we needed to rebuild the whole experience, the whole design experience from scratch.
How was the process with taking in user feedback and taking in like help from users during the product development time?
Yeah, so I like to talk with the Botsociety users a lot. There was a period during, we did the 500 Startups Acceleration Program. There was a period during that time where I would have 20 minutes call full time for the whole day, like from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And of course, for the users, it was not 8 a.m. Like they were, folks all around the world. But so I really, really like to learn about like how folks are using Botsociety. And what we discovered was that the use cases were tremendously different. Like we had, student at NYU who designed a smart pillow that you can talk to before you go to sleep. We had folks who were building mobile chatbots for mental health. We had, companies building desktop website bots for customer support. We had SMS bots like all over the place. And so what we realized was that, okay, one of the things that we really need is make this tool as versatile as possible, as abstract as possible, in the same way that, say, Sketch is abstract, right? Like you can design a mobile app, you can design a website, anything. We needed to find the right level of abstraction. And it was much higher than what we initially thought.
Mm-hmm. So now that you've kind of hinted around what Botsociety 2 can do, tell us what's possible to do with Botsociety.
Yeah, so the first thing is this, like you have this very powerful level of abstraction that allows you to design for anything. Like you can set it up in a way that you can design for your car interface, you can design for your VR experience, and then in the same tool, in the same way, like learning the same stuff, you can also design, an SMS bot or an AVR interaction. So anything where the conversation is the main interaction, you can do. I think that's very groundbreaking. We're really excited about how the community is going to use it. And, we gave it as a private beta to some teams already. They already did crazy stuff that I cannot disclose, unfortunately. But like on both on voice and chat and, on the phone and in the house and like totally different cases. So that's the first thing. Like you can design anything. And then you can design everything, as in like you can define the whole flow. So you can start abstract like a flow chart, but then you can dive into like, okay, what happens if the user does this and that? They don't understand each other. What's the second use case? What's the third? How they play together? Like you can flesh out the whole blueprint of your interaction, down to, okay, what happens if we're on a separate device and on this device we have less real estate, and stuff like that. So it's really powerful. You can, in that, like you can define precisely what happens to the interaction. At the same time, you can have like an eagle view. Mm-hmm. And then like you can collaborate. So that we kind of like brought it from Botsociety 1. So, you can collaborate in real time. You can add comments, you can share, you can, preview and that kind of things.
Yeah. And I have to say, this is a comment for me as a product manager. We definitely, for the collaboration side of it, while Botsociety is a conversation design tool, people are so used to having very high levels of customization in sharing and, access levels. And I think Google Drive has just set such a standard in every industry for how teams collaborate together. So we really tried to go for that and make it possible for teams as big as they are, or as big as they're growing to be, to work on Botsociety too.
Yeah, and I think, look, like design is difficult to if you're not in the same room. Mm-hmm. Like, I both design and write code. I write less code now, admittedly, because my team is threatening me to remove my privileges of writing code because I'm not into that as much anymore. But like I can tell you, like by doing both, it's way easier to write code by yourself in this COVID situation. We're all home, right? So like it's way easier to do that than design. Like design, you really would like to. You really need to have like a design critique moment where you show your design around, you think it through, right? You really want to have also precise feedback sessions and precise points on specific parts of the design. And so one of our aims with Botsociety 2 has become in the recent months is like, okay, how do we empower design teams to continue to collaborate in this environment on this type of interfaces that even before the pandemic were really hard to collaborate on because they are substantially different than a graphical user interface. So it's easier to point out, okay, the position of this button is not there, but like why this question is not working out and which question exactly is not as easy to point that out, just because you're missing the visual part, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, when you're building these interfaces, like you really want that because the way that you design a question or an answer, it's really going to impact the user experience and, how the bot is perceived in the end, in a substantial way. So
yeah,
it's important.
Exactly. To get more conceptual, how do you imagine a conversation, and how has that influenced how you've kind of driven and shaped the Botsociety product?
Yeah, so I think here, like, we need to differentiate between like what I personally think and how we build Botsociety. And this is one of the exercises of making an abstraction design tool, as in like we know that designers have different mental models of how the conversation should be designed. And we want Botsociety to be as versatile as possible, so it should accommodate all the different types of mental models.
Mm-hmm.
So my mental model, I'm not imposing what I exactly think inside the product. I try to make it we try to make it as versatile as possible. That said, like, there is some opinion on that, in the same way that, the auto layout feature in Figma, there's some opinion there, right? So it's kind of inevitable. But so what I think is the best way to design a conversation is identify the use case, maybe with pen and paper, and then try to write the script of the epipath. And once you have the epipath fleshed out, and that takes some time to get that conversation going, like to get that on a level that it's intuitive enough for the user. Then you start to design like the repair path. So what happens if the user and the bot do not understand each other? And then you add some levels to it. What happens if they don't understand each other for a second time? What happens if they don't understand each other a third time? And then you start to say, okay, what are the other use cases that we may cover and how they're connected? And you start to create the other ones. That's how I personally think. Another approach is that you take the highway. So you basically go like with a big flowchart first, and then you start to script every flowchart one by one. And it also depends what you're building. Because if you're building, say, a customer support bot that is taking over a part of a flow that is already existing, then okay, it's easier to start from a flowchart, because you already have a flowchart. It's just arriving from the customer support team, right? So, it depends. And in that case, like, you start with this kind of like higher level block. Okay, this is the use case. And then you go on and you write the script there. But I think in the end, you will end up with the same thing, you will end up with an interaction that has some main epipath or epipaths, and some deviations from there that you try to repair, or that, represent a secondary interaction compared to the main one.
And that makes me think of, recognizing and designing conversational design patterns. Can you tell us more about those and how to design them on Botsociety?
Yeah, I'm championing this idea, and I think the response from the community has been very interesting, especially at the San Francisco Design Week and Rasa conference last week. So if you heard that, sorry, because you're going to be bored for the next couple of minutes. I'm going to repeat a couple of concepts there. So what's the idea of the conversation design pattern? I think one of the things that can get you started in conversation design is starting to abstract some of the elements so that you can reuse them across your designs. And it's kind of difficult for conversation design because conversation is so natural that you're not thinking about it as patterns or blocks or elements, right? You're just having a conversation, like you've been doing that since you were a kid, right? But instead, with graphical user interfaces, like it's easier to say, this is a button. This is the idea of a button. I can replicate that in my design. Because it's not that natural, and so it's easier for you to kind of like take a step back and conceptualize it. So that's the idea behind conversation design patterns. Is like let's start to define this kind of like ideas that you can reuse across your design. And so, for example, one basic conversation design pattern is the one that I was mentioning before, where you design the epipath and then you design a repair path of that. And so this is not a generic repair path that is triggered wherever the bot and the user do not understand each other. You design an happy path, and then you say, okay, what happens if at this point in the interaction the user and the bot do not understand each other, and you design a dedicated repair path, right? Something like, I'm sorry, I do not understand you. I was expecting, a date. But so you can say stuff like, next week or last week of September. Like, so this message is a dedicated repair path. You're designing it specifically for that point of the conversation. And so basically, this is a pattern that you can use. So you have an happy path, and then you identify where you think is most probable that the user and the bot do not understand each other, and then you kind of like try to repair that specifically. And this is built on a conversation principle that you have in mind, that that is the collaboration principle. So if now I stop talking and I kind of like refuse to go on the conversation with you, that would not be good. Like, that would be kind of aggressive. And the reason is that when we're having a conversation, we're kind of sharing this idea that we're both collaborating, like we're both trying to move this conversation forward where we want it to be. And that's very ingrained in your brain. So basically, when you're frustrated because the bot is just saying, I'm sorry, I did not get you, you're actually not frustrated by the fact that the bot did not understand you, because you expected a little bit. What you're frustrated by is this collaboration principle being broken, because you feel like there's no collaboration at that point. It's not like they understand you. It's like I'm basically trying to sabotage the point here, the conversation. And so a dedicated repair path kind of like goes beyond that, because it's showing collaboration from the bot side, right? It's like, I'm sorry, I do not understand you, but at this point, like, I'm trying to figure out the date of your of your delivery. So
yeah, and I think those are also good to help manage expectations. It's like you're showing the user that the bot is trying to meet them halfway, and if they don't understand, there is some guidance they can provide.
Exactly. And the technology to identify those situations and to bring them up, it's been out, in the major technology platforms for quite some time. So there's a chance, like, if you have an engineering team that is working on it, there's a 90% chance they can build something like this. But I feel like the reason why we're not seeing this a lot in the industry yet, it's because it's like, from a design point of view, it's not straightforward. It needs some design thinking behind it, and it's not as easy as designing the happy path or the generic repair. And so we're looking forward to empower the design community there, because I think that's one of the steps that the conversational AI experience in general can take to make it a lot better.
Great. What are your plans for Botsociety in the future?
That's a great question. So we want to be the design tool that you use for any type of conversation interface, and that you can then, plug into whatever your engineers are using, so that they don't need to copy paste, but they can just take what you designed and bring it in the technology that they want. So we want to be the design layer there, and we'll keep being extra focused on that, and we'll keep building features to empower the design community and building partnerships with, the Rasa, the Dialogflow of the world, the Microsoft Bot framework of the world, to make sure that your engineering team not only is very clear about, okay, the expectation of the design team are those, and they can give you feedback on the design and stuff like that, but they can also kind of like kickstart their development process leveraging what you designed.
So even starting from the tools that you just mentioned, which have been developed like over the last couple of years, what excites you about conversation design and the future of conversation design?
That's a good question. So I think there's okay. I of course have a lot of ideas about this, right? But so I think one of the most exciting things is, in general, even if I'm biased, but if I were to take a step back, like if you take a look at the stuff that's being researched and worked on in the design space right now, I think conversation design and accessibility and inclusion are the main areas that you can really say something new and you can explore as a designer. That's what I feel like. This is an opinion, of course, but I would say those are the areas where I would look into if I wanted to, venture a little bit forth compared to what's already structured and just going building on designing on top of what's already been defined versus defining the new things of the future, right? That's what I feel like in the design space. Those are the main areas that where this is happening right now. That's why I get particularly excited when you see projects that are mixing both things. Those are very, very exciting for us. And so we'll try to give more highlight to that. There's usually, not a lot of economic incentive to do, inclusion UX and accessibility UX. But we think that conversational interfaces can actually bridge a lot of gaps there and help a lot of folks. And so this is one of the things. So like it's one of the few areas in design where you can really express yourself and kind of like venture forth in a more uncharted territory and come up with something new. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is, AI is out there, and I don't like the expression so much. So let's say like machine learning algorithms and technologies are out there, and they are going to change how we work. I think in a substantial way, and I think it's really underappreciated how much that is going to impact us, just because it's happening in real time, and it's not like a switch that happens like from 0 to 100. But it's happening, and so I think the creative community, the design community, needs to be involved. And when it's involved, like stuff gets better for the humans. And if it doesn't, then it can it can show some ugliness. So I think it's really like conversation design. It's really a way to a wedge into making sure that this machine learning revolution takes a human face, like that respects our values, the both political, like democratic values, and human values, so that these technologies will go in the right direction, because they can go in any direction right now.
That's a great point to start like ending on. Next I'm gonna ask your favorite question, actually, that we try to ask to the other guests. What do you listen to get inspired?
Oh, yeah, this is my fault. I really like to listen to electronic music when I'm designing conversations. And the alternative is just silence, because we want to kind of like play the conversation in your head, or on Botsociety if you're using Botsociety. So, either one of those two, like a music without words, because otherwise, like, my brain goes there. So there are some exceptions. So, like, if there are songs that really comes up in your brain as conveying the personality of the bot that you're designing, I like to do that as well. And so that's the only exception. So let's say that you're writing like a very I don't know, grumpy persona, and there's a ironic song about somebody grumpy, then that's funny. Like you listen to that and kind of like craft the personality. So because you tend to associate personalities with music. At least I do. So with music, so that may be fun. Yeah. But it's not like you're always designing the personality. It's kind of a step in the conversation design process.
Yeah, I've wondered what your answer to this is for a while, Vittorio.
Oh,
yeah. So next, we usually end with audience questions that we've collected ahead of time. And this time, since it is a special episode, we have a couple of questions from San Francisco Design Week, actually, and the talk that Vittorio gave there. So Ken asked, how does a writer get started with conversation design? I'm in freelance marketing and UX writer looking to provide this service for clients.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I would definitely start with just books or YouTube videos about conversation design. In terms of books, I really like the Katy Perry one. I really like Designing Bots. And then I think on YouTube now, you can find a lot of talks about the topic in general from the Google Conversation Design team, but also from other teams. I think you can also find some free resources from Robocopy, which is also doing great stuff. So just in terms of like getting the concepts in, but I think in the same way that it's easier to learn design while you're designing stuff versus just a lot of theory and then a lot of practice. I think you should do the same with conversation design. And so I would just go on Botsociety or a flowchart tool or Google Docs or whatever, and I would start to try to design a conversation of a bot that you would like to use. And I think that just the exercise of trying to do it actually brings up a lot of good questions usually, especially if you already have a writer or design background. Mm-hmm. And then I would say third step is just like sharing your knowledge in terms of portfolio. If you design some stuff, or I think, by the way, sharing the portfolio is one of the most powerful things that you can do right now, because a lot of people say they're good at designing conversations, but they're still learning. And there's not a lot of portfolio out there, though, because of this. So I would definitely do that. And then, a portfolio for a conversation design is usually a video, but you can also take screenshots and then do a Medium blog post and then embed the video. That's what I would do. And then if you share that with prospects, especially if the design is relevant to them, I'm sure that you can find either companies, like bigger companies who are looking forward to for some help on the conversation design front, or a direct customer that will value your work.
That's a great answer. I'm glad Ken and the listeners who might be wondering, who might have the same question, have an actual list of steps to follow. So the next question is from Sirena, who asked, what's an ideal KPI if time isn't a great metric? How do we dial in too much versus too little time?
Yeah, that's a great point, because sometimes you don't want, so this is one of the difference with graphical user interfaces, is sometimes you don't want to take time spent as a good thing. So for example, let's say that you designed, and this is another conversation design pattern that I didn't get the chance to talk about here, because otherwise I would talk all night, is the slot filling conversation design pattern, where basically you design something that requires multiple data points from the user. So for example, like where would you like your stuff delivered and when? Those are 2 data points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can design it in a way that the user can tell you both in the same phrase or in the same message. And that's actually a better user experience. It's a faster user experience. It gets to the point faster. And so if you take time as the KPI, then it's not a good KPI because you don't want people to spend a lot of time telling you where and when they want their stuff, right? You actually want to minimize that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's important when you're designing this stuff, that you also keep your team aligned on, okay, on the website, it may make sense to track, how much time they're spending there or whatever. But like in this case, we should try to minimize that from point A to point B. So I think a very good KPI in that case is the amount of people who expressed the intent, so who started the interaction, versus the people who ended the interaction in a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's a better KPI. And so basically it's like, okay, if it takes more than 30 seconds, we consider you out, for example. And then you say, okay, what's the drop-off ratio there? So more like a funnel in that, so that you can say, okay, what happened to the rest of the guys or the girls, the users, and what happened to them, and you discover like, okay, they went through the repair path and or not, or maybe they left, and you start to optimize that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can test this also before even having your bot in production. I know we took the funnel approach in our user testing feature on Botsociety, where you can see how many users answer this question and get to the next one. And yeah, the time is definitely an added layer to that.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the design process actually. So, like let me say it like that. It's a conversation that if you start during the design process, then it's very powerful. You don't want to have the conversation when the bot is already live since a couple of months,
Yeah.
like, right? Because then it's like, oh, the tracking is not in place. Are we optimizing that or not? So, yeah.
We've come to our last question for this episode. Katie asked, where do you see conversation design in the future?
I think it's going to get more and more interesting as more companies realize that they need to scale their relationship with their customers and their users, and that the conversation interfaces are another way of doing that. That everyone will expect at a certain point. And we're already seeing that a lot, especially in certain verticals like technology, like financial services. But we expect eventually every company to need something like this. So what's exciting, I think, about conversation design is that I think in the next 5 years, we're going to define what conversation design actually is, together with the users who are using this type of interfaces. And then, we're going to be set. And that's going to be it. In the same way that user interface design was out there since years before the first websites were designed, but you actually needed the critical mass of internet users that use those websites to actually come up with the best practices there. Mm-hmm. So that's what's going to happen in the, I would say, future, in the near future, 5-7 years.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Vittorio, for being on this episode of our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you were going to invite me, but in the end you did, so I'm really excited.
It's hard to get an invitation.
I know. It's an honor.
Thank you, and I hope everyone enjoyed this special episode. We have taken a little bit of a break with the podcast because we were working on getting Botsociety 2 out, but we'll be back with more frequent episodes right after this one. That's all for this episode. We hope you liked it. Subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening to this episode. We will continue to interview people in the chat and voice spaces in different fields. Know someone who could be a good fit or have a topic request? Let us know at info@botsociety.io or at Botsociety on any social media. Botsociety is a conversational design tool. With Botsociety, you can design voice and chatbot interactions in the same way you design apps and websites with Sketch or Figma. We have a free plan. Check it out on botsociety.io.